October 1913. Jung is 38 years old, sitting at his desk in Küsnacht, Switzerland, his career in free fall. He picks up a journal, hand-bound, heavier than it needs to be, and opens to the first page. He writes the first words in red ink. What he puts down in that journal over the next 16 years will be kept from the world for nearly a century. His family will seal it inside a bank vault. Scholars will spend decades begging to see it. The estate will refuse every request. The lock will hold for 48 years after his death. The question that should bother you is simple. What was in it that no one was allowed to read? Most people who know Jung's name have never heard of the Red Book. That fact alone should tell you something. Everything taught about Jung in psychology courses, the shadow, the persona, individuation, the collective unconscious, all of it was born inside this book. Every concept, every framework, every idea that made him one of the most referenced psychologists in history emerged from what he wrote and painted across those pages. But the source material, the raw encounter that generated all of it, was hidden. The theories were allowed out. The experience they came from was locked away. The book itself is unlike anything else in the psychological literature. 205 pages, hand-lettered in medieval calligraphy, illustrated with full-color paintings Jung created himself. It looks less like a work of psychology and more like an illuminated manuscript from the 13th century, something you'd find in a monastery, behind glass, written by a monk who'd lost his grip on the ordinary world. When it was finally published in 2009, the edition weighed nearly 15 pounds and cost almost $200. Jung himself called it the prima materia, the raw material, for everything he would later become. And for nearly half a century, it sat in darkness, inside a literal locked room in a Swiss bank, waiting. Today, I'm going to walk you through what the Red Book actually is, why it was hidden, what Jung found inside his own mind during those 16 years that made the book too dangerous to publish while he was alive, and why what he discovered about the nature of reality still carries enough force to unsettle anyone willing to sit with it honestly. Because the Red Book isn't a historical curiosity, it's a confrontation, one that most people, if they understood what it was actually saying, would do everything in their power to avoid. To understand why the book exists at all, you have to understand the year that broke Jung open. By 1912, he was one of the most prominent young psychiatrists in Europe. Freud had essentially anointed him as the heir to the psychoanalytic movement. Jung had a thriving practice, international recognition, a growing family, a career trajectory that looked, from every external angle, like the model of professional success. And then he published a book called Symbols of Transformation, and the whole thing collapsed. The book directly contradicted Freud's theory of the libido. Jung argued that psychic energy wasn't primarily sexual, that it was something broader, more fundamental, more connected to the human need for meaning than the human need for pleasure. Freud took this as betrayal. The friendship ended. The professional relationship ended. Jung's position within the psychoanalytic movement evaporated almost overnight, and with it went his sense of intellectual direction, his community, and the professional identity he'd spent a decade constructing. What followed was something that, described from the outside, sounds like a psychiatric emergency. Jung stopped sleeping normally. He started having waking visions, vivid, uninvited images that arrived during ordinary hours, while he was eating breakfast, while he was seeing patients. He heard voices. He had experiences that he could only describe as premonitory. Fantasies of Europe drowning in blood, rivers turning red, the earth heaving and splitting. He initially interpreted these as evidence that he was losing his mind, that something in his psyche had snapped under the weight of the professional rupture and was now producing hallucinations. He seriously considered checking himself into his own clinic. 3 months later, the First World War began. The blood he'd seen flooding Europe wasn't metaphor, it was happening. And Jung was left with a question that would determine the course of the rest of his life. A question with no comfortable answer. Had he seen something real? Was what was rising from underneath his conscious mind something other than psychosis? Was it possible that the unconscious had access to information that the waking mind did not? Most psychiatrists in his position would have done the sensible thing. They would have suppressed the visions, committed harder to professional routine, chalked the whole experience up to stress, and moved on. Jung did the opposite. He made a decision that he would later call the most important and most terrifying choice of his life. He decided to follow the visions, to go toward whatever was pulling at him from underneath his rational identity, rather than away from it. To treat the unconscious as if it had something to say and then actually listen. What this looked like, in practice, was strange enough that Jung only described it fully decades later. Every afternoon, he went to the shore of Lake Zurich and built small structures out of stones. A miniature village, a church, houses. He was a middle-aged psychiatrist with an international reputation, kneeling in the dirt like a child, stacking rocks. He knew how it looked. He did it anyway, because something in the activity opened a door in his mind that intellectual effort couldn't reach. In the evenings, he sat in a chair in his study and deliberately let his mind fall. He didn't meditate in any structured sense. He just released his grip on rational thought and allowed whatever was waiting below to rise. What rose was overwhelming. Images, figures, voices, entire scenes that played out with a vividness he compared to waking dreams. He wrote everything down. He sketched. He transcribed the dialogues he had with the presences that appeared. These raw notes became the first layer of what would eventually become the Red Book, chaotic, frightening, written in the handwriting of a man who wasn't sure whether he was documenting a breakthrough or a breakdown. Over the years that followed, Jung went back to these raw notes and began transcribing them into something more permanent. He chose red ink, then black. He taught himself calligraphy. He painted the visions in full color, images that are, by any standard, extraordinary. Snakes and mandalas and figures from mythology he hadn't consciously studied. The journal became an illuminated manuscript, a work of art, a document that Jung treated with a seriousness that bordered on reverence. He wasn't just recording his inner life. He believed he was preserving something that had been given to him, something that didn't entirely belong to him, and therefore couldn't be treated casually. The figures Jung encountered in the visions weren't random. That's the part that disturbed him most, and it's the part that should disturb you too. What he found when he descended beneath his conscious identity wasn't noise or chaos or the meaningless debris of a stressed psyche. He found what he experienced as autonomous presences. Figures with their own perspectives, their own knowledge, their own agendas that didn't match his conscious intentions. The first pair appeared together. An old man he identified with the prophet Elijah, and a blind young woman he associated with Salome, the biblical figure who demanded the head of John the Baptist. The pairing made no sense to him. An ancient prophet and a woman associated with seduction and death, arriving side by side, speaking to him as if they'd been waiting. Jung didn't choose these figures. He didn't construct them the way you construct characters in a novel. They arrived. They had things to say that he didn't expect. They behaved in ways that contradicted his conscious assumptions. Then came Philemon, an old man with the horns of a bull and the wings of a kingfisher, carrying a set of keys. Of all the figures Jung encountered during those years, Philemon was the one who changed him most profoundly. Philemon became something like a teacher, a presence Jung held extended conversations with, who communicated ideas that Jung did not consciously possess. Jung was explicit about this point, and he returned to it throughout his life with a kind of insistence that made his more rational colleagues deeply uncomfortable. Philemon was not a product of imagination in any ordinary sense. The figure seemed to have independent existence. He said things Jung didn't already know. He corrected Jung's thinking. He introduced perspectives that Jung's conscious mind had never considered. Jung later wrote that Philemon taught him something he called psychic objectivity, the understanding that there are contents in the psyche that are not produced by the conscious mind and cannot be fully controlled by it, that the unconscious is populated, that it contains intelligences, perspectives, forces that are, in some meaningful sense, other. This was the first dangerous idea in the Red Book, and Jung knew exactly how dangerous it was. He was a psychiatrist. He treated patients who heard voices and saw figures. He knew the diagnostic categories. And he was saying, from inside his own experience, that the diagnostic categories were too small. That some of what psychiatry called psychosis was contact with a layer of reality that most people never access, and that the profession had no framework for understanding. He wasn't claiming that every person who hears voices is having a legitimate encounter with the unconscious. He was far too careful for that. What he was claiming was more precise and, in its own way, more unsettling. That the boundary between the inner world and mental illness is not where mainstream psychiatry draws it. That there is a territory between ordinary consciousness and psychosis that is real, that can be navigated, that contains genuine knowledge, and that almost no one in the Western world is taught how to enter safely. The Red Book is his map of that territory, drawn from the inside in red ink with paintings. And his family looked at this map and decided the world couldn't have it. Understanding why requires looking at what Jung himself said about the book and what he didn't say. He told his family it was his most important work. He spent more time on it than on any of his published writings. But he also told them it was dangerous, and he used that word deliberately. He deliberated for decades about whether to publish it, and he never did. He died in 1961 with the book still in manuscript form, and his son Franz moved it to the bank vault shortly after. The surface explanation for keeping it hidden is professional. The Red Book doesn't read like psychology. It reads like mysticism, like visionary literature, like something written by a medieval theologian in the grip of divine encounter. If it had been published during Jung's lifetime, it could have destroyed his credibility as a scientist. The psychiatric establishment was already skeptical of him, already inclined to dismiss his ideas about the collective unconscious as unscientific speculation. Publishing a hand-painted manuscript full of conversations with autonomous figures would have given his critics everything they needed to write him off entirely. But the deeper reason goes beyond professional risk. The Red Book doesn't just describe Jung's inner life. It makes claims about the nature of reality, claims that contradicted the entire materialist framework that Western science had spent 2 centuries constructing. The book argues, through experience rather than theory, that the inner world is as real as the external one, that it operates according to its own laws, that it contains knowledge the conscious mind cannot access through rational means, that everything we've built our civilization on, the assumption that what's measurable and external is primary, and what's internal and subjective is secondary, might be exactly backwards. The Jung estate kept the book locked away for 48 years. When a scholar named Sonu Shamdasani finally spent years negotiating for the right to publish it, navigating family politics, legal obstacles, the reluctance of heirs who weren't sure the world was ready, what he found when he opened the vault and examined the manuscript made him say, on the record, that it was the most important unpublished work in the history of psychology. He wasn't being dramatic, he was being specific. The book contained the source code for an entire school of psychological thought, and the source code was far stranger, far more radical, and far more unsettling than the polished theories that had been extracted from it. The locked room in the Swiss bank wasn't metaphorical. It was a physical space with a physical lock, and the book sat inside it for nearly half a century, while the ideas it generated traveled the world without their origin story. The shadow, the persona, individuation, the collective unconscious, all of these became part of the psychological vocabulary of the 20th century. But the experience that generated them, the 16 years of descent that made them possible, the raw encounter with something that Jung himself struggled to name, that stayed in the vault. The children were allowed out. The mother was kept in the dark. And that pattern, the ideas released, the experience suppressed, tells you more about the book's danger than anything written on its pages. Because ideas can be managed, ideas can be debated, qualified, absorbed into existing frameworks, domesticated. An experience of the kind the Red Book describes cannot be managed. It demands something of the reader. It implies that the locked room isn't just in a Swiss bank, that every person carries a version of it, that the vault has been holding something for years, possibly decades, and that the question of whether to open it is the question the book keeps asking, on every page, in red ink, with paintings. This is where the surface history ends and the real excavation begins, because what's in that book, what Jung actually found when he followed the visions into the territory beneath his conscious identity, isn't a story about one man's psychology. It's a set of claims about the nature of reality that most people are never allowed to hear clearly stated. And the reason they aren't allowed to hear them has less to do with their truth and more to do with what those claims would require of anyone who took them seriously. Jung spent 16 years going into the rooms that most people keep sealed their entire lives. The locked doors he opened weren't in a bank vault. They were in the deepest layers of his own psyche, and what he found there became the foundation for everything he taught. If you felt that pull toward your own depths, that persistent knock from something underneath the surface of your daily life, the reflection exercises in our guide, True Self-Discovery, were built for exactly that threshold. 24 practices drawn from Jung's teachings, designed for the descent rather than the surface. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. But stay with me here, because what Jung found on the other side of that descent changes everything about how we understand what's real. The Red Book opens with a distinction that, once you understand it, makes everything else in the book, and possibly everything else in your life, land differently. Jung didn't begin with theory. He began with two voices. He called them the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths, and he presented them as forces that had been competing inside him for years before the book was written, before the visions, before the rupture with Freud made the competition impossible to keep ignoring. The spirit of the times is the easier one to recognize because you've been listening to it your entire life. It's the voice of the era you were born into, the consensus, the shared agreement about what counts as real, what counts as valuable, what qualifies as knowledge, and what gets dismissed as delusion. In Jung's day, the spirit of the times was scientific materialism, the conviction that what's measurable and observable is primary, and everything else is either derivative or imaginary. In ours, it's something broader and harder to pin down. A combination of that same materialism with the digital certainty that reality is whatever can be captured, quantified, optimized, and shared. The spirit of the times tells you what a successful life looks like. It tells you what to pursue and what to dismiss. It provides the categories through which you sort every experience, every feeling, every encounter into something legible. And it does this so completely, so seamlessly, that you forget it's a filter. You start mistaking the filter for the world itself. The spirit of the depths is older, much older. It doesn't care about your career. It has no opinion about your social standing. It doesn't know what century you were born in, and it wouldn't adjust its demands if it did. The spirit of the depths is the voice that speaks in dreams you can't explain, in sudden knowing that arrives without evidence, in the persistent feeling that something is profoundly wrong with your life, even when everything appears to be working. It's the voice Jung had been hearing underneath his professional achievements for years, the one that got louder after the Freud rupture, louder still during the visions, and finally loud enough that it took over the Red Book entirely. What Jung wrote in those opening pages, stated with a directness that he rarely used in his published work, was that the spirit of the times is always incomplete, always. Regardless of the era, regardless of how advanced the science, regardless of how sophisticated the cultural framework, the spirit of the times, by its very nature, filters out everything the depths contain. It has to. If it didn't, the consensus would dissolve. The shared agreement about what's real would fracture. People would start paying attention to things that can't be measured, can't be optimized, can't be turned into productivity, and the entire structure